Hi, my name is Elmarie Mortimer, and I'm an AP Physics teacher here at Trinity Preparatory School in Winter Park, Florida. And today I want to share my presentation, Cat's Cradle, introducing modeling into the physics classroom with you. Now, I did not misspell modeling in my title. I intentionally wanted to make a differentiation between modeling, as in the act of representing a physical scenario, versus modeling instruction, which is an inquiry-based way of teaching physics. So if I refer to modeling in my presentation, I really refer to those type of scenarios where we model a physical scenario. Now, I'm not going to do a traditional talk. I want to tell you a story. The story of why the title of my talk includes the name of a book by a very prominent science fiction writer. The story is not about me and why I am a big science fiction fan. It's rather a story about an idea that two teacher friends at our school had. Could a single summer reading book be used in various disciplines? The one teacher teaches AP history and opted for Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle as a way to start the discussion on the impact of science development on the American experience. The AP chemistry teacher was hoping to focus on the fictional Ice-9 element that plays a central role in the book. Both teachers were lucky, educational-wise, in that there are pre-existing assignments and rubrics for this text in their disciplines. I wanted to be in on the fun, but there were no pre-existing physics assignments that I could fall back on. My only option was to read the book and hope for inspiration to strike. And by the end of the book, I had it. Newt, the young son of the brilliant scientist in the book, is extremely annoyed when his dad is playing the cat's cradle. No wonder kids grow up so angry. The cat's cradle is nothing but a bunch of X's between somebody's hands. And the kid looks and look and look at all those X's. And there is no kitty. There is no cradle. There is just a bunch of X's and a string. How many times do my students see nothing but a bunch of X's and a string? So let me show you what I talk about when I talk about a bunch of X's that they see. This comment, how could you ignore air resistance? How many of you have read the final discussion at the end of a lab report where they explain why ignoring air resistance was the reason why they could not determine the gravitational acceleration with a marble launcher and a meter stick to yield a value of exactly 9.8 meters per second, or even better? Who of you have had similar battles with the lab write-ups? And I'm not referring to the fact that physicists habitually ignore the independent variable on the x-axis rule. I keep reminding my students, remember, it's just a model. You make the rules. No, they don't get that the trend line actually models their data. And so they try and determine the gravitational acceleration from the individual values rather than from the slope of the trend line. Or my personal favorite, why are we using conventional current flow when we do circuit analysis? I'm going to focus on this last question to illustrate how I make use of the different models in my physics classroom. But before I do that, I want to introduce you to just another book that has been very instrumental in my teaching and has opened my eyes to my students' struggle. Visible Learning for Sciences. The book is based on John Hattie's research where he synthesized over 800 meta-analysis to uncover what actually improves students' learning. I don't want to discuss the visible learning in detail here. I just want to point to 3 critical ideas to help you see beyond the X's. Science classrooms where teachers see learning through the eyes of these learners and learners see themselves as their own teachers provide the greatest learning environment. This statement is fast becoming the motto of our science department and is definitely the basis for successful teaching approaches like the modeling instruction, ISIL, and the flipped classroom. The second idea is that learning is a process, not an event. And this process actually has a couple of steps. There's surface learning, which must not be confused with superficial learning. This is in the initial development of the conceptual understanding, the process skills, and the vocabulary of a science topic. That transfers to deep learning, and then, of course, to transfer learning, where students are able to take the concept and apply it to various other scenarios and other disciplines. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a practical example of how I implement this in my physics classroom. I start the week by placing a connecting wire in front of every student. This was at the end of the school year. It was our last week of instruction. My aim was to tie back to what my students already knew, that transfer of learning that visual learning talks about. In front of me was a group of sophomores and juniors who had written their AP1 exam. All of them had completed a year of honors chemistry. One student's even written an AP chemistry exam. So they all knew about atomic structure, they knew about the periodic table, they knew about electrons. I also wanted to uncover what students already know about circuits. Graham Nuthall in the Hidden Lives of Learners has shown that students already know 60% of what we want them to learn in our classrooms. So I started by asking the students a single question, and then they were allowed to come up with more questions in their group. My question was simple. Why did I put the wire in front of you? Their questions centered around, why is the inside made of metal? Why is the outside covered in plastic? What is this thing at the end of the wire called? In fact, the alligator clip, where sometimes it's also called the crocodile clip, allowed us to discuss the fact that sometimes terminology differ from country to country, and that is okay. Our job as a user of a model is to find these differences and reconcile the differences. Some of the students even knew to start talking about the electric force. They also came up with the terminology Coulomb force, especially if they had higher level chemistry. Now, at this point in a non-COVID year, I would probably do a kinesthetic activity to model the electron flow in the conductors and insulators. A recent publication of the physics teacher shows you a way of doing it, where the students line up in a row to model the crystalline structure. And if you then, for example, want to present how electron flow in a conductor works, the students will all hold their arms high above their head with a ball in one hand. And the teacher can then pass the ball to the first student, which would from a bucket on this left-hand side. And this would then force the student to pass the ball that he or she originally had onto the next student, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, up until the final student can drop that ball on the bucket to the right. And this is already a way that we now know about the students are starting to model electron flow. So our next activity, we could look at a waterfall analogy. This is now where the students are starting to talk about electron current flow. Interesting enough, that previous kinesthetic activity that I showed you also made them realize that electron flow and conventional current flow is nothing else but just a different point of view. Let's look at what the students already know. They know about force. They know about force acting over a distance that creates work. This work shows up either as a change in the kinetic energy or can be stored as potential energy. So we use an inquiry-based approach and start talking about what happens in a waterfall, where initially the water has a high gravitational potential energy at the top of the fall. It has a lower gravitational potential energy at the bottom. And if we assume the only force acting on the water during that fall is the gravitational force, which is a conservative force, then energy is conserved. And that means that gravitational potential energy stored at the top was converted into kinetic energy as the electrons fell. So this activity allowed me then to introduce a simple circuit where we just had one battery and some connecting wires and a little light bulb. And I said to the students, okay, what does this now mean? It means that there is a high potential energy at the negative side, and this a low potential energy at the positive side, and this potential difference is converted into kinetic energy as the electrons flow through the circuit, making the light bulb glow. So the next question is then, what would happen if I use two batteries? Of course, the students immediately realize we have now lifted our waterfall. I can continue. I can ask the next question. What would happen if I use two light bulbs? Of course, the students first just predict what they think they're going to see, and then they make an observation, and then I encourage them to tie it back to the waterfall analog that we had at the top there. And the students, takes them a while, but then they come up with the idea that, oh, clearly now a waterfall has got a ledge in the middle, and it acts like two single battery waterfalls, one on top of the other. And then we step it up again, and we say, okay, but what happens now if we have two light bulbs in parallel? And again, they do the prediction, they tie it back to the model, and they go and they say, oh, well, now we have two waterfalls falling from the same height down. Okay, but suddenly our model starts becoming a little bit complicated, because they've now realized that that height of the waterfall can be tied back to the brightness of the light bulb. But if I have two waterfalls, where do they split? Does it mean that there's now less volume of water falling down, and therefore less electrons flowing, but still the same brightness? How does this work? So it's clear that we sort of reached the limit of our waterfall analog, and that we need to switch to another model. And this is where I bring out the breadboards. Now, I have a hate-love relationship with breadboards. Students struggle to understand how to use these breadboards. And I always feel like I'm wasting time during the school year on a non-essential topic. And so I tend to not use the breadboards. At the same time, students love using the breadboards because they say, well, it makes them feel like real scientists, because this is what real scientists do. So because I was opting for the learning experience, we brought out the breadboards. Very simple setup, which is two batteries and then a resistor. And we just simulated this switch. They could switch it open or closed on the one side. This also allowed me to bring in, or to talk to them about multimeters and how do we measure this potential fall that we now have, that we were talking about in a waterfall. So we started out with a simple circuit, and I asked the students to first just measure the potential across the battery when there is no current flowing, open circuit, and then when there is a current flowing. And you can see their results there at the top. And now we could start talking about why is there a difference between the two, and introduce the concept of internal resistance in the battery. The next step is to step it up a little bit and start measuring the resistance across the potential across the resistor, and then of course switch out the resistance. Every time they need to predict what's going to happen, I'm going to put in a higher resistor. What do I expect my potential is going to be? And keep doing this. And then I end up with some data that they now can step up and make a graphical representation of the data, where we drew a graph of potential versus resistance. I ran out of time at this point, so we didn't really go into any more detail than just look at what the data tells us. what happens to the potential as you increase your resistance. I did, however, wanted them to have a little bit of fun, and so we played a little puzzle game where I gave them 3 resistors, and then I told them, okay, see if you can build me a circuit where the potential drop over the resistance is the highest possible, is the lowest possible, is exactly 3 volts. They really enjoyed this, and they also quickly started realizing it's a puzzle game, and some of them started using this graphical a graph that they drew and graphical analysis to actually come up with some sort of mathematical model of how they could solve the puzzles quickly. Now, this is all fine that we were playing around with this, but the question is there a way that I could test if my students actually did some learning? And so what I opted for was right at the end to give them a clear and coherent paragraph response. I gave them an old AP Physics 1 question, free response question, and I asked them to just write down what they know. Now, I have to digress a little bit here and explain to you why the answer sheets look so interesting. So let me show you the answer sheets first of all. You can see they're in crayon. What happened was that it was the end of the year. One student did not have any writing implement on him. And I wanted them to write down the answers. So he asked me if I had something that he could use. And the only COVID-safe implement that I had was a box of crayons. The students got super excited about a box of crayons. All of them wanted to use crayons. All of them wanted to write a physics FRQ in crayon. You could see they even decorated it for me. I got flowers, there's a stem to a rose, there's stick figures. It's at this point that I realized that this is what happens in a science classroom. Sometimes my classroom is more like a kindergarten classroom than a church service. And isn't that exactly what we're supposed to be doing? Isn't that what Gina reminded us about the last time, that said, we must stop teaching physics like it is a religion and start teaching it more like an exploration. Now, what did these FRQ answers showed me? Well, first of all of them got the initial claim correct. The other thing that I was quite happy about is that none of them had fallen into this, or stepped into this pitfall of saying, well, the light bulb uses the electron current up. They understood that it was a potential drop. They also realized that they could follow in Faraday's footsteps and use a non-mathematical explanation for something that they've seen there. So in conclusion, I wish I could quote something from Cat's Cradle to tie my whole story back up. But unfortunately, Vonnegut's outlook on life and on science in particular was rather dark and pessimistic. So I'm rather going to quote something from one of my favorite authors that has passed away recently, and that is Eric Carle. In his book that he wrote with Bill Martin, Brown Bear, What Do You See? He taught me the value of repetition. Keep going, show them over and over again how it works. But he also ends the book with the lesson in visible learning. Children, what do you see? We see a teacher looking at us. That's what we see. I want to keep looking at my students to see this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I also want to thank the organizers of the PoLS-T virtual conference for allowing me to share my ideas again. I want to thank Sarah Bradley for all her work behind the scenes to keep me organized. And I want to thank the videographer, Kelly Whitcomb, that is making this all so much easier and helping me through this presentations. And I'm looking forward to our discussions on July 2nd.